Since our time is running tight, and since the governor has to go, and we also have another distinguished guest coming in here, and we don't want to run too long on that, I think what I'm going to do is to get our panel started now. I think one of the great things about Governor Allen's presentation is it really gave us a kind of almost comprehensive look at what we're going to be talking about on the conference. And he touched on all the main points. So now this is our opportunity at this point now to step up and to begin to look at each of these areas in detail. And we're going to start, for this discussion, we're going to start with the one that he mentioned as one of the key ones with regard to both industrial costs, but also in terms of quality of life, and that is the area of electricity and also the area of natural gas and infrastructure. And I'm very pleased that we were able to have here two very leading experts to talk about these two aspects of our discussion. Our two panelists are Michelle Bloodworth, Executive Director, External Affairs for MISO Energy. MISO or MISO?
MISO.
It is MISO, okay. Because when I Googled, I kept finding out a lot of soup recipes, but I wasn't really sure.
We have a lot of people who call it MISO, but it is MISO.
But MISO is correct. Michelle joined MISO in 2015 as the Executive Director of External Affairs, and she provides oversight on MISO's communications efforts, as well as stakeholder relations and client relations initiatives. Before that, Michelle was Senior Director of Market Development at America's Natural Gas Alliance, an association with which Hudson has had a close relationship, which is also part of the way in which we also like to think about the issues of natural gas and the future economy and future economic direction. Richard Kruse is Vice President of Regulatory and FERC Chief Compliance Officer for Spectra Energy's U.S. transmission business. He's responsible for the development and management of the company's regulatory strategy and action with FERC, which, as many of you will know, is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that oversees and directs the nation's power grid, and also directs the pipeline group's position in state proceedings. Each of the states serves by the company's pipelines. He's a busy man as a result of that. He's also responsible for managing the company's involvement in the North American Energy Standards Board and serves on the North American Energy Standards Board's board of directors. Our conference that was here on March 22nd on the geopolitics of America's shale revolution, we touched on the issue of a North American energy block, the components and elements. We had a fascinating panel on just that subject, and what I'm hoping is that Richard Kruse can help shed some light on those subjects as well. And so without further ado, do we know who wants to start first? Michelle's going to start?
Michelle's going to start. Well, thank you. It certainly is a pleasure and an opportunity to be at the first time at the Hudson Institute. As all of you will soon find out, I do have a Southern accent, even though I live in Carmel, Indiana, so you'll have to bear with me. As I listen to Governor Allen, certainly the natural gas and the shale gas revolution is having a profound impact on the power generation industry and really all aspects of the power generation industry. But from a MISO perspective, it certainly has benefited our members, whether you're a vertically integrated utility or you're a merchant generator. In those resources and our goal of providing and ensuring reliability of the grid, it has helped our members as they are facing, as Governor Allen mentioned, many environmental mandates. We are seeing a volatile and a very different change, especially in the MISO footprint of the generation mix and the mix of the fuel resources. And as we're seeing more intermittent, whether that's solar or wind, really the ability of natural gas to provide that flexibility, we're seeing a lot of growth in the use of natural gas and even supporting intermittent and renewable generation. And then, of course, we're also seeing them take advantage of the lower priced natural gas, and that is certainly driving up, from a generation standpoint, the amount of megawatt hours now that are coming from natural gas versus other fuel sources, and certainly seeing a lot of retirement of coal. As Arthur mentioned in my introduction, most of my long career has been in the natural gas industry, and so I always joke with former FERC Commissioner Moeller that I took gas-electric harmonization to a different level and decided to join the electric industry. I think what has been an eye-opener for me, because I've been in the natural gas industry for 25 years, is there is so much planning and coordination. I thought I knew a lot about electricity involved in the natural gas power generation side until I came to work at MISO. But the electricity industry and the challenges that we are facing as we try to integrate not only natural gas, but intermittent renewables, both wind and solar, it is a very complex industry. And so having long-term planning and coordination, and I'm very lucky, and my friend over here, Richard Kruse, and I have served on several panels, but really the coordination that's going to take place is going to be much greater as those industries, both the electric and the natural gas, are more aligned and integrated and hopefully harmonized in the future. But Richard and Spectra Energy has certainly been one of the most aggressive pipeline companies that I've had the opportunity to work with over my years of service on the gas side, and really trying to be aggressive in constrained areas and develop, because we all know we have an abundance of natural gas, but being able to get it delivered to the point of use where it is needed, we are going to need a lot more, not only infrastructure, but pipeline products and services. And so he'll certainly share with you the perspective from the pipeline side. A little bit about who is MISO and what do we do? What do these independent system operators do? At MISO, we are, from a geographic standpoint and from a capacity standpoint, we are the largest. We have the largest organized market in the country. We span all the way from Manitoba all the way to Louisiana. So we serve not only the Midwest, but with the entrance of Entergy into our market, we now have assets in MISO South, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Our footprint, as you look at all of the ISO RTOs, whether that's New England, PJM, CalISO, or MISO, we are unique as it relates to natural gas in a couple of different ways. One, MISO is primarily vertically integrated. And so by that, I mean we have the opportunity, MISO does, to collaborate with our utilities and with our state regulators, public service or public utility commissioners, to really make sure that we have firm capacity, we have infrastructure, we have a regulatory model very different from which Richard will speak to, I'm sure, in the New England and the Northeast, that allows us to have the regulatory and the policy structure to fund long-haul interstate pipeline capacity. So we do spend a lot of time making sure that utilities and policymakers have appropriate information to make those important decisions, to make sure that when that gas generator is called upon in a 5 minutes notice, that gas is delivered and that electricity is just as reliable as it was when it was being generated from a coal plant. The other unique benefit of MISO is we pretty much have access to any shale basin in the United States, whether that's North Dakota, you mentioned the Bakken, whether that's in Louisiana, the Fayetteville Shale, whether that's kind of the granddaddy of them all, the Marcellus or the Utica. We pretty much have, we are the crossroads for the majority of all of the pipeline network. What has really changed in the gas industry, and Richard will speak to it as well, is now pipelines are bidirectional. So we can move gas east to west. We can move gas west to east. We can move it from the Gulf. We can move it down. That creates challenges, but it also creates a lot of flexibility one of the benefits of a regional and why people join an organized market is because we pool the resources in all of these 15 states. That provides a lot of economy of scale. So we have the ability, when we're bringing in a lot of wind, say from the Dakotas, our other footprint benefits from that because we try to maximize all of the generation resources to make sure that consumers, we're providing the lowest price electricity given the differences in those resources, but being able to manage and to understand the limitations, say, of natural gas on a peak winter day is going to be more and more important to MISO moving forward. What's kind of important about this slide is certainly you can see we have a tremendous pipeline network both in MISO South and in MISO North Central, but they're very different as well. In MISO South, Entergy and many of the generators in the South have a lot of experience with natural gas. Most of the generators, I'd say 40%, are connected to more than one pipeline. So they have a lot of flexibility, not only in interstate pipelines that cross state to state, but intrastate. There's a massive amount of intrastate pipelines in the South and especially in the Texas footprint, which allows different flexibilities than we have in MISO North Central. And so in MISO North Central and in the Midwest, where we've had a lot of very large coal generating facilities, we're seeing many of those because of environmental regulations, but also because of low price shale gas retire. Some of those even sooner than expected. Many of those, what's driving it though, is really the economics. And much of that is being replaced by natural gas and by renewables. And so the north to central footprint, we're hoping we really gain from the experience of the South. But the big difference, as I know very well, between the South and the North is the South doesn't have the ferocious winters that the North does. And so when most of our challenges and what we're trying to be proactive and work with Richard and other pipeline entities is really on those cold peak winter days when you're home heating, you're either using it hopefully for heating, water heater, or cooking. When on that peak winter day, we're really competing. Entities are competing with who gets that gas. Does the residential homeowner get it, or does a power generator get it? And so that's where we're really trying to have a lot of communication with the gas industry so we both understand the limitations and the opportunities to make sure on peak winter day that everybody can get it. But in order for that to happen, you've got to have the physical assets, one of those being adequate pipeline infrastructure to be able to serve both of those, especially as the intermittent load grows. Just looking at both kind of the MISO North Central and MISO South, probably no surprise that the amount of generation, both from the amount of kilowatt hours generated and also from installed capacity, we are seeing huge increases in natural gas generation. The majority of what is we call in our interconnection queue is primarily natural gas. Although we're seeing a lot of wind as well and beginning to see an entrance of more, not so much rooftop solar, but more utility solar, especially in the Midwest and the South footprint. Primarily, though, in the MISO North Central, the percentages have been more single digit. And so when those numbers are expected to really triple or even quadruple, the operation of that generation and the challenges that natural gas can plan, if we don't plan for it accordingly, certainly can be pretty dramatic. We're also beginning to see a lot of increase, even in the amount of hours that our generation runs in the MISO South footprint. And so there's lots of discussions about, does it make sense to move more power from the south to the north? If we have a lot of shale gas and a lot of physical assets, how can our footprint maximize even the physical assets that different states or different regions have, really for the benefit of the whole footprint, and that's really what we do on a day-to-day basis. So MISO really has three functions. All of the utilities turn their generation over to us, and so on a day, on an hour, on a minute-by-minute basis, we're choosing which generation is dispatched and which units run across our entire footprint. We also run an electricity market, so we set electricity prices on an hour and a minute-by-minute basis. And then the third function that we provide, which is different than the gas industry in the way that it is regulated, is we manage transmission planning process, which really determines what high voltage transmission gets built, so we can move the generation to the places where the load growth is occurring, or hopefully to eliminate congestion, not only in our footprint, but from all of the other sister organizations and SEAMs that we manage throughout the United States. There's been a large discussion, certainly in our footprint, and we're doing a lot of modeling on the Clean Power Plan. What I would like to emphasize, however, is even if the stay becomes in effect, and even if we don't have the Clean Power Plan, we are still planning for and expect to see a massive amount of growth in both natural gas and renewables, because there's a lot of other environmental regulations that our members obviously are having to comply with, all the way from national ozone ambient air standards to the mercury and air toxics rule to the cross-state air pollution rule. So the only thing really CPP does, it probably makes that timeline a little bit sooner. It certainly makes the carbon standards more stringent. It probably is going to drive more renewables, but we see that transition occurring no matter whether the CPP moves forward or not, and so we are aggressively planning for that change in our generation portfolio as we speak. So one of the areas that certainly we're seeing dramatic growth, as I mentioned, is wind. So we are seeing a lot of wind growth in our system, which is very different than solar. Typically, we can predict when the sun is not shining, but what we're seeing with a massive amount of growth in the wind area is it's typically the wind is not blowing. What we're seeing is when our load is picking up. And so the ability within a moment's notice to be able to supply power when the wind is not blowing is typically we're relying on natural gas. Natural gas certainly has the flexibility and the fast ramping capability as long as it has the storage and the pipeline infrastructure and the physical assets in order for us to call on it in a very short notice. It does create a lot of issues, which is why we're communicating with companies like Richards when we can't really give them notice and they can't plan and generators don't have adequate time to line up supply and buy their gas. And so there are new types of products and services as we look at electricity products and services that we're going to need in a different way moving forward from the natural gas industry. We, in the past when I represented the producer group, we would kind of argue, well, if natural gas was operating the same way as coal, as base load generation, then some of these physical assets aren't as important because you pretty much know every day how much natural gas is going to run. But we really want natural gas. We need it to do more than that. We need it to be peaking generation. We need it to provide ramping capability, and we're going to see it operating more as base load. So really, the gas industry and the electric industry are going to have to learn a lot more about each other and also understand the limitations of one another and how physically electricity and natural gas, they do move and are delivered very differently. Doesn't mean that we can't better align and we can't find products and services on both sides, but we also have to appreciate that we are different, and having a coal pile right there on site is very different than having a storage facility that is miles and miles away, and gas doesn't move as quickly as electricity, and so it just has to be planned for accordingly so it can provide the same reliability as other fuel sources have in the past. Some of the things that are really different, and certainly all of you should be watching, is now looking at both electricity, looking at transmission infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure. So an example would be, we're doing a lot of modeling to say, is it better to bring in remote generation and build transmission to move that electricity, or does it make more sense to locate generation closer to pipeline infrastructure, or is it better to build gas pipeline infrastructure? Is that a lower cost than doing transmission, than doing gas by the wires? It's very case specific, and it all boils down to economics and what is the rate impact of either one, but really being able to examine the synergies between transmission and gas pipeline infrastructure. They both have the same challenges as it relates to environmental permitting, and obviously some pushback either from a high voltage line. Typically, though, gas pipeline infrastructure has a shorter lead time than transmission. The biggest difference in transmission is under the Federal Power Act, and ISO RTO has the ability to determine how those costs with our stakeholders are allocated and to get that funded on the transmission side. Under the Federal Power Act, MISO, as an example, doesn't have the authority, and Richard will speak to how different it is to get pipeline infrastructure funded versus transmission. But one of the things I think you'll see moving forward is a lot of discussion about how we look at those more systematically to take advantage of both. We're also looking at, as we look at new electricity products, we have a new one we're launching on a fast ramping capability. How can we develop pipeline products and services that will better align with the electricity products that we're also managing and our members are buying on a day or an hour by hour basis? And then really trying to examine where we have a lot of generation behind a local distribution company, which is an LDC, moving it to your home. How do we better coordinate when the generation is behind them to really understand the transparency of when that gas is going to be sent to the home heating load instead of the power generation load, and how do we both coordinate together to make sure we don't have interruptions on either side? So a homeowner can get their gas, but the generator also can plan accordingly when they might see a curtailment, as an example. So a lot of different dynamics, but a lot of opportunities for both industries to benefit. So I know we're a little bit short on time, and I certainly want to leave ample opportunity for my good friend over here, Richard, and so we will allow time for questions at the end. But I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you this morning.
Well, good morning, and while the presentation's coming up, I would say Michelle gave me a lot to talk about that I didn't necessarily plan on talking about. But the gas electric industries talk to each other in the past only when there's problems. We have a history of supplying gas to electric generators, and it's a long history. It's a tortured history, in fact. During the gas shortages of the late 60s and the 70s, local distribution companies made the arguments that gas was too precious to be burned as boiler fuel. And we had a federal policy against using natural gas and boiler fuels. And then the industry went out and found an abundance of gas in the 80s. Another abundance of gas in this decade. So the electric industry has relied on gas. It has been pushed away by gas. And we're back to a phase that I think is going to be a long-term relationship of the gas and electric industry working together to provide reliability to all parties. As I said, though, we talk to each other when there's problems. And 4 or 5 years ago, there was a cold snap. There's a polar vortex. Weather gets tight. And the relationship between the industry has grown up such that for the vast majority of the gas-fired generators, they're using capacity that's under contract by local distribution companies. And that has worked very well 90% of the time. When it gets really cold and LDCs need their capacity, we find that there's a shortfall. So gas-electric issues have been, in my mind, really bundled into a couple of areas. There's communication. I mean, do we know how to talk to each other? Do we know the difference between an open valve and an open connection? And one means gas is flowing and one means electricity is not. Do we know who to call? And believe it or not, that is something that it took the prodding of the commission to get us to talk to each other, to establish protocols about communications. There's a lot of concern about sharing market information in those communications because we both are operating transportation grids that deliver product, and there's other market participants, and how do we share that in a way that is transparent but also recognizes some of it is very confidential. But that issue, in my mind, has been checked off. We know how to communicate. Scheduling and coordination, the gas industry had a gas day that started at 9 o'clock, standardized across North America. The electric industry has an electric day that starts at midnight, depending on the region you're located in. And if you're a gas-fired generator trying to operate in both worlds, you're in 2 separate days talking to people about 2 separate scheduling procedures, and the end result is you're always in trouble with somebody. Either you didn't schedule gas and the RTO ISO is making you schedule gas and you can't get gas, but so now you're trying to borrow gas, or you've overscheduled on the gas pipeline because you thought you were going to be scheduled. The RTO doesn't need you, and now you're trying to get rid of gas and you're being yelled at. So being a gas-fired generator is a very challenging operation. They're in the middle. They're torn between 2 different paradigms. And there's been a lot of work on doing that. The Commission the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has just completed a review of the gas day scheduling process. The interstate pipelines have just implemented a new scheduling paradigm starting April 1. I wouldn't have picked April 1 for a major change of scheduling, but that's when we went, and it went, as far as I understand, pretty flawlessly, and we're providing more flexibility in scheduling to the electric industry. The Commission asked the RTOs and ISOs to go through a similar process, and depending on the facts of each RTO, they made changes as they thought was appropriate to improve scheduling and coordination. But the point I want to make is we talk about communication, we talk about scheduling only when there's a shortage of pipeline capacity or infrastructure. That is the cause of the need for all this communication and coordination. And communication and coordination is great, it's essential, but it doesn't create additional pipeline capacity. As Michelle pointed out, I mean, we see deliveries to gas-fired generators, and these are generators directly attached to our pipelines, increasing year after year. The percentages on these slides at the top is the difference between that slide and what we saw this year. So from a 5-year average in the first quarter, we're up 67% this last year versus the 5-year average. The prior year, we're up 39%. So that's how you read the slide. That's true on both Texas Eastern, which is one of our interstate pipelines that runs from Texas, the border with Mexico, all the way up to New York City. And Algonquin Gas Transmission is a New England pipeline that basically runs from New York City to Boston. And Algonquin in New England has certainly been in the headlines for gas-electric coordination. There's tremendous challenges in New England. There's been a tremendous switch to natural gas. That's good. Our pipelines are running full. And when I say full, I don't mean full when it's cold. I mean full in the summer, full in springtime, full in the winter, full year-round. If you don't have a firm contract or a derivative of a firm contract, you are basically not getting your gas scheduled into New England. So the problem is lack of infrastructure. The challenge is how do you build infrastructure? And just in terms of gas-fired generation, you saw how they were growing in terms of their load on the two pipelines. On Texas Eastern, the generators have about 20% of their winter peak covered by firm contracts. The rest of it is being used basically on loan by LDCs. The LDCs release it under the Commission's capacity release process. It allows a more efficient utilization of the pipeline, but when it gets cold, 80% of the gas-fired generators, in terms of their usage, is at risk of being interrupted. And when that happens unexpectedly, Michelle gets very upset. And we are kind of like scratching our heads saying, what's the problem? They're interruptible. You understand what interruptible means. And they don't, or they didn't. And that's really the truth. I mean, they do not look at these generators as being interruptible. They're supposed to run when they're asked to run. And the problem is they haven't made upstream contract commitments. Depending on Algonquin, it's even worse, 16% of the winter peak. And it's Algonquin that is seeing a lot of, in New England, that's seeing a lot of the challenges in terms of gas-electric coordination, communication. So if the issue is infrastructure, what are the consequences of not having that infrastructure? And this really wasn't coordinated with MISO here, but this is a chart in terms of the graphics that came out of the ISO New England recent report, in which they're talking about the impact of pipeline infrastructure constraints. And their point is that New England is very competitive from an electric price standpoint with MISO in the summer months. In the winter months, when the pipeline constraints become predominant because the LDCs are pulling more and more of their capacity back, prices flare up because natural gas is the price-setting mechanism in New England. It's the marginal cost, and as gas into the region becomes tighter, prices go up, and the region pays tremendously more. The New England ISO has managed this reliability issue as we've cut back gas-fired generators by, and this is surprising in some respects, they pay oil generators to stand by to turn on. So instead of burning natural gas, the cleaner fuel, but it's not able to get into the market, they're relying on oil generators and imported LNG to meet that difference. And they've been able to do that, but it's at a cost both in price and in environmental impacts. This gas-electric contracting issue is most predominantly a problem in the PJM, ISO New England markets. Other parts of the market that are more vertically integrated, not as much of a challenge. We see pipeline services, new pipeline additions being built to serve markets in the South, Florida. MISO region is actually benefiting to a very large extent by the fact that, one, their electric transmission lines and generators lay on top of the gas fields, and the producers are anxious to get the gas out of the ground, so they're signing up for a significant amount of new pipeline capacity to move it to markets. But if you're away from the producing areas, like New England, the challenge is who is going to sign up for the contracts? The independent power generators make a very sound economic comment that they cannot afford to sign up for 20-year contracts when they only get 1-year commitments out of the electric markets. You see the logic of their concern, but who is going to sign up has been the biggest challenge, the biggest debate, one that is ongoing in New England as we speak. The load and service characteristics that the generators present can be very strikingly different than what pipelines are accustomed to. Michelle touched on some of the reasons: the rapid ramp up in their deliveries, the fact that some of them come on and then they go off. They're different. It's not impossible for a pipeline to serve them. We've made a lot of accommodations to meet the needs of the electric generators. Spectra Energy is one of a few pipelines that actually schedules gas on an hourly basis. So we're scheduling gas for any given day. We give a generator about 42 different hourly nominations because they start a day ahead to fine-tune their deliveries. We make non-ratable deliveries, and that is a phrase that means they get more than a uniform percentage of their gas in 1 hour versus others, which is important to the RTOs and ISOs. So the pipelines can provide the services that the generators need. Infrastructure can be built that will provide any flexibility that they need. The challenge is, and there's really two, is finding a customer and then getting it permitted and built. And the timelines for permitting are fairly predictable. Currently, we're under constant pressure from various opposition groups that tend to prolong it slightly, but you can make your planning horizons and make decisions. But we're not 1 year away. We're not 2 years away if you're talking about major pipelines. We're 3 to 4, and if you add in the commercial negotiations, maybe 5 years away from adding infrastructure from the day you start in saying, well, I want to build infrastructure. I get the question often, if you see that there's a need for additional pipeline infrastructure, and this is true in New England, well, why don't you just build it? And that's not the economic model. That's not the regulatory model. We are not permitted by FERC to build without contracts. And quite frankly, given the pricing structure, we wouldn't build without contracts in any event because these are 20-year long-term commitments that we need in order to raise the capital. The LDCs are building across the country. It's been a tremendous infrastructure build-out by both Spectra Energy as well as other pipelines. Producers are signing up for capacity. Generators or their utility owners in some parts of the country are signing up for capacity. But in the Northeast, the debate continues to be the appropriate, and it's a challenge both in PJM and New England. And with that, I will close with an optimistic statement that we think there's a solution, and it's Access Northeast. Slide. And it gives you the services we're willing to provide generators if someone who has the credit to stand behind it was willing to sign up for a contract. Thank you.
Okay, this time I am going to resist the temptation to exercise my prerogative to ask the first question. But I'm happy to open it up to questions if you have any questions.
Sure.
We've got 1, 2, and 3. How's our mic?
T.X. Amos, National Defense University. Neither of you mentioned industrial use of natural gas feedstock. How much of a problem is that for the infrastructure, or do they simply build them close enough to the source that it's not an issue?
It can be an issue. I mean, it's just like any other service component. They need to have some secure access to pipeline capacity. Most of them are being served by marketers, and generally they're located either behind local distribution companies, or they're historically where they were at various times. So there's usually capacity going by them, and it's just a question of them securing a supply. The pipeline business, we're not in the supply business. I mean, people come to us, and it's a two-step process. You have to both have capacity, and you have to have a natural gas supplier putting gas into the pipeline to get gas out of it. But industrials, if they're not in the appropriate location, they can need to have a capacity expansion to serve them. And that will either be done by a local distribution company as part of their service territory, or they'll have to do it independently.
The only thing I would add from a power generation standpoint is industrial load is typically pretty consistent. It's more 24-hour a day load, so it typically doesn't have the ramping and the cycling that some of the other load that we're experiencing behind our utility. So from that standpoint, it's a little bit easier to manage on the power side.
The gentleman in the middle, too. We got your...
My name is Alan Mendelson. I'm just a part-time resident of Washington, D.C. and Vermont. My question to you is, why is it so difficult to get gas pipelines in Vermont? Most of us who live there pay for oil or propane, both of which are twice as expensive as gas. We would love to have gas pipelines, but even though we appeal to our senators, Messrs. Leahy and what's his name, Sanders, neither of them seem to be at all interested in bringing pipelines. Now, I wonder whether or not we need some great big electric generator in order to attract pipelines. But there are thousands of people throughout southern Vermont and southern New England, if you will, that would love to have gas pipelines built, because it wouldn't take us 5 minutes before we transferred from oil to gas. Thank you.
There would be many pipelines that would support you coming out and expressing that vocally in the permitting process. I mean, it is challenging to build pipelines in New England. It's challenging to build pipelines anywhere, but it is critical as we go through the permitting process that private citizens and businesses step forward and express their desires, because the opposition to pipelines, the advocates for alternatives or anything but a gas pipeline are very vocal in today's environment. So you have to get out there to get your voice heard.
Isn't gas much more environmentally friendly than oil or propane?
Yes.
So why should environmentalists be opposed to it?
I don't.
We don't understand that in Vermont.
I think
Well,
we have
that may not be unique to people in Vermont.
I think we have the subject for our next conference. I'm going to hear here, and then we'll have a question there.
Thank you, Richard and Michelle. My name is Kevin Easley, and I'm with the Department of Energy. And I'm just curious, from your all standpoint, given the extended low price environment we've now seen dating back to June of 2014, and really more so since November, when OPEC made their decision in 2014, for both oil and gas commodities, do you see any chill happening with respect to infrastructure investment and build out, whether it be from pipelines to generation facilities, since obviously there's a tremendous amount of coal retirement going on? I'm just curious. We've certainly in the LNG space globally seen a pause and some cancellation of final investment decisions and projects given the low price environment. I'm just wondering, from the gas electric integration point of view, particularly in New England where there is deficient or has been deficient infrastructure, what do you see as a relationship between the extended low price environment and infrastructure build out? Do you see that being delayed, or any thoughts you have on that would be really welcome? Thank you.
As it relates, certainly let Richard speak more to the footprint overall, but in the MISO footprint, we've seen a little bit with the uncertainty of CPP and the stay, a little bit of a delay in some of the units that are in our interconnection queue, which certainly would probably need some infrastructure development, be delayed a little bit. However, we are seeing many of them are still, even though it might be deferred a year to 3 years, they're still moving forward with the need to build new generation. We certainly think that we need to be aggressive, proactive. Our reserve margins, even in the Midwest, are declining as much of that older coal is coming offline. And so some of the pipelines, as an example, bringing gas from the Utica and the Marcellus are still having some issues in final permitting and funding and the contract issues that Richard, but we're hopeful that those projects are still going to move forward, but maybe delayed a little bit. Other than that, we're not seeing that much of a delay with the ones that are already in the ground.
We have one final question over here.
Hi, Annalisa Kraft from Point Logic Energy. My question is for Mr. Kruse. Your competition, Kinder Morgan, they're trying to build Northeast Energy Direct. You're trying to build Access Northeast, and then there's Constitution Pipeline. And the FERC comments, there's literally tens of thousands against these, and you have the opposition from the Massachusetts Attorney General, New York Department of Environmental Conservation, et cetera, et cetera. My question is, why do you even put up with the aggravation? And at some point, aren't pipelines just going to stop being built in New England? I mean, quite seriously. Like 2018 maybe? Won't there be enough capacity available with what's being in service?
Well, there's, I guess the short answer is we get paid to put up with the burden of this, but I mean, Algonquin Gas Transmission has been delivering gas into New England since the 50s, so it's a long time player, and it cares about the region. The projects that we're pursuing, we're very focused on staying within existing right-of-ways where possible. That minimizes, doesn't eliminate, but it minimizes some of the routing concerns. We have a very extensive stakeholder outreach to make sure that parties understand how we do business and how little of an impact having a gas pipeline on your property can be, and we try to be good neighbors. Our success rate, despite the challenges, is very good. I mean, we are under construction right now on a major expansion on Algonquin, and it's serving LDCs. We have another expansion, again, serving LDCs and some end users that is working their way through the permitting process. And then this last project, Access Northeast, we're in the pre-certificate phase, and and the model there is that we're working with the local electric distribution companies who also care about the region and who care about the competitiveness of electricity prices, and they see the benefits of bringing more gas to the region, and they're willing to be that credit-worthy entity I was talking about. The challenge is, of course, that there's a lot of opponents to that who are questioning whether it's a good idea for the EDCs to get back into providing that backstop to capacity, even though that's what the local gas distribution companies do for gas pipelines. But that's the challenge, and it gets caught up in the wind and the renewable debate. And occasionally I get asked the question, I mean, is it a problem that you don't have any spare capacity? Don't you like that fact? And certainly as a pipeline, you like being full, but it does have price consequences, and the opportunity is by paying some more in pipeline capacity, you can have a dramatic impact on the electric price, and that, in our opinion, is beneficial for the entire region.
Well, it's obvious that this is a situation in which the issues do not revolve around technology, but revolve around political will. And it just goes to the adage that you can lead the public to a technology, but you can't make them utilize it. So this is going to be, I think, an issue that's going to come up more and more, and it's going to become more and more of a major focus for discussion, both in the political sphere, but also, I think, too, in thinking about the economic futures of regions which don't have access to that kind of natural gas resources and the potential for power that they represent. I want to thank both of our panelists for a marvelous presentation. Thank you. It's 11:13. We are running on a tight schedule, as you know, so we are going to reconvene here at 11:16, and I mean that, for the next panel.